All right, give 1 more minute and then we'll start. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you everybody for joining our session today. My name is Neeraj Kumar, and I have been conducting Azure Talk sessions for a year now, and we have conducted more than 50 sessions. These sessions take place on every alternate weekend, that is on Saturday, and we try to cover different topics on Azure. And in past, we have covered more than 50 sessions on Azure. So if you want to, refer our past Azure Talk, you can always head over to our website, www.azureeasy.com, and you will find all our recorded sessions out there. So that's where we post our recording. We also have our YouTube channel. So in case you want to head to our YouTube channel, you can head to youtube.com/c/AzureTalk. So these are the two places you can find all our past recordings. Plus, we also have our Azure Talk Telegram community group, a group which is by the people for the people, and we have all the experts from Azure. They help answer your questions. So any questions you have, you can go out and post those questions in the chat. It's an IM, instant messenger based community group. So you can use it from mobile, from desktop, from laptop, anything, and you can post your questions. So the community is very helpful. It's growing very rapidly in the last 6 months. So we have grown up to 3,200 plus members, and it's growing bigger and bigger. So if you are not already part of our Azure Talk group, please feel free to join that. And we also have a couple of other Azure related group, which if you're interested, you can join too. One is for Azure DevOps, so it's t.me/Azure DevOps Pro. And the other one is for O365 and EMS, which is O365 Talk, t.me/O365 Talk. So you can join any of these groups and you can post your questions. In case if you want to receive meeting invite, regular update on our sessions, please do register on our website, www.azureeasy.com. You have a registration link out there so that you'll receive the meeting invite. Having said that, I'll move on to our speakers. I'll go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Today's speaker is Gaurav Mathur, who is an MCT, Microsoft Certified Trainer. And he has worked with Microsoft. He was my colleague at Microsoft. So I and Gaurav both worked at Microsoft. I got an opportunity to work with him as a support escalation engineer. And now he works with IBM India and he's database architect. So he volunteered to come and talk on this forum about Azure SQL Security, and he's a database. Yeah, he was my go-to guy whenever I had any issues with SQL. So today Gaurav is gonna take us through Azure SQL and Azure SQL security features. In fact, we will have more sessions from him. So I welcome him as a part of this Azure Talk initiative. And with that, I will move to the agenda item. So what are we going to cover today? And then after that, I will not steal the thunder from Gaurav, and I'll hand it over to Gaurav. But before I get into agenda, just for housekeeping purpose, I have muted the audience. So in case if you have any question, please type in the chat. We want to make sure that we take the question at the same time. We want to make sure the quality is maintained, the recording quality is maintained. So that's why I muted the audience. But don't get discouraged. You can type your questions in the chat, and we will respond to those questions, or we can take up those questions, on the meeting itself. In case if you have to really speak up, you can raise your hand, and we will unmute yourself, and then Plus, we'll also have a Q&A session. So let's get straight into the agenda. So today's agenda is, we'll go and talk about Azure SQL Security, but before even get into the SQL Security, we'll discuss about different offering of Azure. What are different flavors which are available in Azure. Then from there, we will get into the database security layer. What are different layers? What are the defense mechanisms that you can apply for SQL database? Then We'll talk about access control, which is one of the security layer. And today we'll delve much deeper into the access control part, and we'll try to cover access control portion. So we'll cover access control. Under that, we will talk about how to limit or how to restrict access to server. So we'll talk about SQL Server / database firewall. That means, the firewall which you can apply at the SQL Server level and the database levels. So we'll talk about that. We'll have demo of that. We'll also talk about Azure SQL Service Endpoint or Service Endpoint in general, how it helps to secure your SQL workload, especially the platform as a service offering from Microsoft. How can you securely access it from a VM inside a VNet? Then we'll move on to the next portion of access control, which is at the database access layer. We'll talk about how do you authenticate to your database. So now we'll talk about SQL and Azure AD Integrated Authentication. In fact, we'll spend more time on Azure AD Integrated Authentication and how to set it up and how does it really secure your access to your database. Then we'll talk about authorization using roles and permissions, or different roles which are available in Azure SQL, and what kind of permissions is granted to you. Some of the roles and permissions are like, would be same what you see in today's SQL, which is running on-prem. Then we'll talk about access control, especially on the application side, how application controls the access. We can talk about. We'll talk about row level security, which is a feature which limits access to certain rows to certain users, and we don't want to expose all our data. So we'll talk about that. And finally we'll talk about dynamic data masking, which is another feature, security feature, which with that you can mask a certain column of data so that the user don't have full access to the actual data. Finally, we'll have Q&A as usual, and we'll take all your questions, even in the chat also. We'll take those questions, and all this will be accompanied by the demo. So we'll try to cover this as much as possible. I know we have limited time, so with that, I will hand it over to Gaurav to talk about Azure SQL offering. So Gaurav, go ahead and unmute yourself, and you can begin.
Yeah, hi Neeraj. Everybody is able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Neeraj. It's my pleasure to be here on AzureTalk today. I saw earlier recordings and I was very keen to participate in that. So thank you so much for inviting me on this one. My name is Gaurav, and I am database architect at IBM. I have mostly worked on SQL Server for almost 14 years, and 5 to 6 years I have spent on Oracle database administration. Very recently I have started working on Azure platform, and Azure SQL database and SQL Server on Azure VM are one of my favorite database systems on which I'm really enjoying this particular platform. So as I'm learning, I'm just trying to share those learnings with everybody. So today we'll talk about security in Azure SQL database, and as my buddy Neeraj talked about this agenda. In Microsoft Azure SQL offerings, we have PaaS, Platform as a Service, which is Azure SQL database, and it comes in singleton as well as elastic pool. So when we talk about singleton, it's like we are giving one database to the customer. In elastic pool, we have pool of databases in one logical SQL Server instance. So the second one that we have available is the Azure SQL Managed instance, which is in preview right now. So once it will be ready for the customers, it will be in general review. I will definitely talk about that. The third one is SQL Server on Azure VM, which is infrastructure as a service offering from Microsoft. If you look in the diagram, you can see at the bottom I have SQL Server physical machines, which is raw iron, Then I have SQL Server Private Cloud, where we have virtual machines plus appliances. And then we talk about the SQL Server in Azure VM. And finally, we have the my main topic will be Azure SQL Database today, since the security is, I mean, there are so many differences. Of course, there are similarities, but there are differences when we talk about the security in Azure SQL Database. If I talk about SQL Server in Azure VM, that is infrastructure as a service, most of the security features are similar to on-premises SQL Server. So my main topic, as I said, today will be mostly on Azure SQL Database.
All right.
So if we talk about the Azure SQL Database security layers, if I look at the outermost layer, we have activity monitoring, in which we have database auditing, where we track different activities like any kind of DML statements or DDL statements, logins. We are tracking the connections. So this database auditing feature is available in Azure SQL DB, along with the threat detection, where Microsoft provides this feature that it lets you know if there's any kind of threat coming and how to resolve it. The second one is access control. And in access control, we basically look at the server access. When I talk about the server access, especially in Azure SQL Database, I'll be talking about the logical SQL Server instance access as well as the database access. So if we talk about the logical SQL Server instance access, I'll be talking about how do we set up the server firewalls and the service endpoints. And in database access, we'll be talking about different kind of authentication, like SQL Server authentication and Azure AD integrated authentication. I'll be also talking about the application access, in which I'll be covering row-level security and dynamic data masking today. So this will be our topic for today. We'll be covering the whole of access control. So I'll be talking about server access, database access, and application access. In my forthcoming sessions, I'll try to talk about data protection layer, where I'll be talking about encryption at rest. So we'll be covering the transparent data encryption and the encryption in use, which is always encrypted. And of course, we'll be covering encryption in transit, which will be the SSL layer.
All right. Let's move to the next slide.
Yeah. So if we look at the database access, especially the Azure SQL database access, as we talked about the logical SQL Server instance, we have two types of firewalls in this. The first one is the SQL logical server firewall, which basically prevents all the access to the database server until we specify which computers will have the permission using the firewall rule. This particular firewall will will grant the access to all the databases within that logical SQL Server instance, and it is based on the originating IP request of each request, IP address of each request. All the connection attempts from the internet and Azure will basically pass through the firewall before they'll reach the Azure SQL Server or the Azure SQL database. Now, if you look at this particular diagram, it's basically from MSDN. First, when the connection request comes in, the database level firewall rule comes into picture. The database firewall rule is checked. If the IP is available, if the rule has the particular IP, it will be granted the access to a particular database for which the database firewall rule is created. If there is no database firewall rule, then the next step would be to go towards the server level firewall rule. In server level firewall rule, again, the originating IP will be checked. If it is present, then access to all the Azure SQL databases within that logical server instance will be available. If there is no server firewall rule, then there will be a connection failure. So My firewall rules are based on the IP rules, that is based on internet IP address, and the virtual network rules, it is based on the virtual network service endpoints. Neeraj, you would like to talk about the service endpoints?
Sure. So, like, as Gaurav pointed out, you have firewall rules applied at two levels, server level and database level firewall rules, right? So he talked about the walkthrough how the rules will be applied. So first, the database level firewall rules will be evaluated, and then next, the server level firewall rules. But how do you really, how do you really compose these rules? What are the constructs of these rules? So the construct of these rules are the two things that you can use. One is IP-based rule, where it is based on the originating IP of the client who is trying to access. And remember, these IPs are internet IP addresses, by the way. So it's any outbound IP address. If you are coming from your CorpNet, probably that could be the IP address of your proxy server if you're coming through the proxy. In case if you have any VM which is running inside Azure and you are allowing them to access, so then their public IP address gets added, which is like 000. So like you can just think about it. That's the public IP. There is an option which allows us to give access to Azure services, all Azure services, without having to explicitly apply any IP address. But there is a catch that opens up for not only for that server but also for other servers running in other Azure subscriptions. So that could potentially be a problem, and that's where Microsoft has come up with the virtual network rules. So virtual network rules, it works in conjunction with the service endpoint. So service endpoint, I'll talk more about service endpoint in next, but in general, you can restrict your traffic saying that, hey, please accept the traffic only from certain VNet. So the VNet where your VM is. So now that way you can restrict and you can tie down your access to your database or firewall to one VNet. So you don't have to open it for the entire internet, or you don't have to give a NATed IP to your, or you don't have to give a public IP to your VM which is running in Azure to access the Azure SQL. Yep, that's what I wanted to add. Okay, so I think
Thanks,
yeah, so the last one is default deny rule. So like, if you have not explicitly given permission to connect to database, by default it is denied. Nobody can really connect to your database, period. So you have to explicitly give, you have to create a rule with allow permission. So by default, it's a default deny rule which applies to the firewall rules.
Yeah, thanks, Neeraj. I would like to add this point again, that first of all, the database level firewall rule is checked before the server level firewall rule is checked. Why? Because for a logical SQL Server instance, you can have multiple databases. So if, let's say, I have database 1, 2, 3, 4, and I want to give the access only to a particular IP for database 1, in that case, I don't need to give my IP at the server level firewall. What I can do is I can give the IP at the database level firewall, so that first it will be checked and it will give me the direct access to database 1. So we have to remember this thing, that if we are not keen on providing the access to all the databases inside a logical SQL Server instance, in that case we should always focus on the database level firewall instead of the server level firewall.
Yeah, that's a good point to bring up, Gaurav. Okay, all right, thank you. Let's move on to the next slide. All right, so this is where, like, probably I'll spend a little bit more time. As I said, a previous slide, we did talk about the SQL Service Endpoint. So SQL Service Endpoint is a part of a bigger, service offering from Microsoft, which is Service Endpoint. So Service Endpoint is a concept, which is which has become general GA, just 6 months or maybe 8 months back. So in essential, the Service Endpoint earlier, if you had any VM in your VNet, and if it is trying to access any PaaS resources, like platform as a service resources, now those PaaS resources could be Azure SQL, this could be Azure Key Vault, that could be Azure Data Warehouse, that could be an Azure Storage account, all these and multiple PaaS services. So earlier, if you had to really allow that connection, these PaaS services would only accept traffic over internet endpoint. So basically, your machine needed to have outbound internet connection in order to access the PaaS services. Now it posed security risk for a lot of customers, because a lot of these workloads are very highly sensitive and they don't want to expose it over to internet. So in that case, they couldn't build a solution which used VM running in Azure inside a VNet and a PaaS service. So basically a mixed solution, IaaS and PaaS. It couldn't work for them because they have to open their internet port. So essentially, it was discouraging a lot of people to adopt PaaS services, especially Azure SQL. So what Microsoft has done, they have come up with this something called service endpoint. So service endpoint is where what they have done is now the traffic meant for PaaS services wouldn't go over internet. It will not require an outbound internet connection. Rather than Microsoft will route this traffic through Microsoft backbone. So it doesn't have to leave Microsoft backbone of Azure. It will travel over the backbone and you can access it. In fact, you will not require any internet connection. You will not require any public IP for your VM to access. Now this works because Microsoft has implemented it, and what they do is when you implement service endpoint, you have to go and enable it at the VNet level, and then subsequently you have to configure at the firewall level of your Azure SQL to accept traffic only from that VNet. So next time any VM running in that VNet trying to access Azure SQL, the traffic will get routed over the Microsoft backbone, and it will not go over internet. So this was one of long due security feature which Microsoft brought it in last Microsoft Ignite, if I'm not mistaken, and after that it's there. So as I said, service endpoint, it gives you a private connection from your VNet into your any of Azure services, which is platform as a service. It will utilize Microsoft backbone. Some of the key benefits I've already talked about is improved security. Why? Because now you don't need to assign any outbound internet connection to your virtual machine, right? So that will improve your security posture for your organization. A lot of financial organizations, they are very, very particular about it, especially the banking sector. Second is optimal routing. Now, what that means today, if you didn't have service endpoint, your traffic will go out to internet, and from internet, it will come back into this. So now this will take a long hop. The traffic will take a long hop, as opposed to now you have direct connection, which is going over Microsoft backbone, which will be faster and optimal routing for traffic. So that's another key benefit. And finally, it's easy to set up. You don't need a public IP. You don't need to configure an SG for outbound connection. Nothing. It's just a simple click on your VNet level. You can enable the service endpoint. So there are multiple service endpoints. So Azure SQL Service Endpoint is one of those, and we'll see that in the demo. And on the SQL firewall, you will say, go ahead, please accept the traffic only from my VNet, VNet 1 or VNet 2, whichever VNet you have. So these are some of the benefits that you have for using Azure SQL Service Endpoint. And with that, I think we are going to get into our first demo. So I will request Gaurav to go ahead and share his screen. Gaurav?
Yeah, just give me a moment. I'm just doing that.
Sure. So meanwhile, if you have any question, you can type in the chat and we'll try to answer those questions for you.
Neeraj, are you able to see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay. So since we are talking about the firewalls, I just wanted to show you, this is my DNS India logical SQL Server instance. and I have a database in it, which is called DNS.
Gaurav,
So
if I may interrupt you, just if you could you click on the sharing icon on the top so that we don't see that bar on the right side on the top, the docking icon.
This one?
Yeah, on the rightmost. Yeah, on the rightmost there is a pin. If you click on that, yep, it will. Yeah. Yep. Thank you.
Is it good now?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So this is my logical SQL Server instance, which is BNS India, and I have a database which is called DNS, which is Azure SQL Database. If I have to look at my SQL firewall settings, the logical SQL Server instance firewall settings, I will click on this, and I can add the client IP addresses, and I can set a rule here. If my organization has a particular subnet which has a range, then I can definitely give the particular range, and then all of my employees can connect to the Azure SQL database.
So Gaurav, clarify it for me. Right now, are we looking at server level firewall or a database level firewall?
That's just, yeah. So you can see at the top, my BNS India, that's a logical SQL Server instance. So that's my server level firewall.
Okay. So I mean, we can make these changes at the server level. And can we, I mean, I think you have probably will also cover the database level firewall, so I'll hold my question.
Yes. Yes. So this was at the SQL Server, logical SQL Server level. If I have to look at my database firewall, what I'll do is I'll go to my SQL database.
Can you go back to the server firewall once again? I just want to discuss one option which we had there.
Sure.
So mainly you go to the property and then you go to the SQL Server and then the firewall. So if you look at the option, there is an option called allow access to Azure services, right? So that's where if you turn it on, so by default, if you turn it on, in that case, any VM running in Azure, not only in your subscription, but also other customer subscription will also have access to this. This is not a good security practice. So ideally in production, what you would do is you will turn it off and allow explicit access to your virtual machines via service endpoint. And this is where you will create the service endpoint integration. So you will turn this off, allow access to Azure services. And if you scroll down to the bottom, if you can for me a little bit,
yes.
Yeah, so this is where you see that virtual network you can specify your existing virtual network. Now, this setting will work only if you have enabled service endpoint at the VNet level, which we'll talk about this. But I just wanted to talk about this allow access to Azure services is where which allows access to all the Azure VMs, not only in your subscription but also other customer subscriptions. So it cannot really distinguish that the traffic is coming from your Azure service hosted in your subscription or customers other customer subscription. But if we enable service endpoint, and we can come here and we can add those virtual networks, and then probably we can do that. So that way, you can restrict your access to your VNet.
No, I think that was a very important point which you discussed. I think we discussed it a few days back also, Neeraj, that this particular point, which is allow access to Azure services, if I enable it, if I switch it on, then definitely the services which are already on Azure, they don't need to have a firewall rule. But the problem is any Azure services from any other customer can definitely access this particular database. So to stop that, I think the service endpoint comes into picture, and that is a very, very important thing which the customers were waiting for a long time from Microsoft.
Yep. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Neeraj. So what I'll do is I'll just go and show the database firewall features. So
Yeah, while we quickly waiting for it, maybe we can also walk through service endpoints. So if you have any virtual network for me,
I don't have it. If you want to take the uh, the the control, and if you can show it on your machine.
sure. So yeah, that
I
that
don't
I
have a
can.
VNet on this particular subscription.
Okay, so let me quickly log in. But meanwhile, go ahead and discuss the database level firewalls on this point. Okay, so the question is, considering the security issue, is there any real reason to have that allow access to Azure services option? Well, that's a very good question. Should we allow that? Probably not, right? So when service endpoint was not there, at that point of time, you may have use cases for it, but once the service endpoint came into the picture, I wouldn't think that it's needed, right? So that could be the reason that probably why you would use it and why you wouldn't use it. And Arun said, yeah, probably is for a small organization. Yeah, that could be a potential thing. Yes, that could be for a small organization. That's possible. They can use it. But again, these are probably this feature was there prior to the service endpoint introduction. So let me go ahead and share my screen while. All right. Let me know if you can see my screen. Can you guys see my screen?
Not yet.
All right. So another question from Ravi Raj is, why can't we have private IP of VNet where I'm having, well, yeah, that's where Ravi Raj, the service endpoints comes into the picture. So what I'm going to show is, so, what you can do is you can integrate your SQL Server firewall to accept only traffic from one of the VNet. So like, for example, I have this Azure VNet 1. And if I come here, so there are two pieces to it. One is you have to enable service endpoint on the VNet level, and then on the SQL Server firewall level, you have to go and allow the firewall rule to accept traffic only from the private IP range of Azure VNet. So this will solve your problem about having to specify the private IP. Now, can you specify the private IP of a VM? I don't think that's possible today, but what you can do is you can say that accept the traffic only from one VNet, and that VNet means the private IP range of that VNet. So if you're looking at here, I'm looking at the VNet property, and I have service endpoint over here. And if I come, there is no service endpoint which is enabled. You'll have to enable service endpoint. By default, there is nothing enabled. And if I go ahead and click on it, as I said, service endpoint there are multiple service endpoint which Microsoft is supporting today. So one is, if you can look at it, I have all this. So let me blow this out for you guys. All right. So I have, Microsoft has service endpoint for Cosmos DBs, Event Hub, Key Vault, Service Bus, SQL, and storage. So obviously we want to enable this so that the traffic, if you enable service endpoint, traffic will not go over internet, rather than will take this private route. Now, so I will say, Microsoft SQL, because that's what we wanted to, and you need to select the subnets, which all subnets you want this to apply within your VNet. So now this is where, what you can do is, you can specify the database layer. So like, I have DB subnet. So I'll say, okay, only, rather than I'll say app subnet, only accept the traffic from app subnet inside my VNet. But for this demo purpose, I'll go ahead and select all, and I'll update it. Once this is updated, and if, let's see, if I have a firewall, if I have Azure SQL, so let's look at this. I should be able to add, my SQL Server firewall. Now, I don't see anything, so let me go ahead and create a SQL database for you guys so that we can really add it. So I'm going to say AzureTalk SQL DB, and I will create a new one, AzureTalk demo. That will be my resource group. And you have option, when you're creating a SQL, you have option to either bring your own backup, so that will populate it, or you can take a sample one. So I can take a sample one. And this is where you specify your server settings. So, you can specify the server that you have. So, this is already there, or you can create one. I mean, this is a logical server, by the way. This is not like, something physical server. So, Azure Talk DB server. And then you can specify your username and password. So I will say admin. I'm not going to tell you my password. And all right, so this should, okay, so it's saying now it cannot take that. All right. All right, so this will go ahead and provision my server for me. And why I'm getting this error message? Oh, sorry, I have to create a new one. So Azure Talk. All right, so this is done. I've created my SQL server and then Elastic Pool. This is where you decide. You remember we talked about single sign and we talked about the Elastic Pool, right? So, in this case, I'm not going to go with the Elastic Pool. So this is single sign, and this is where you decide your pricing tier. What depending on what tier you choose, you will get different workload and this size of your database and DTU, database transaction unit. So like I will go with the basic one, so that 5 DTU I get it, and with 2 GB of space, and I should go ahead and create it. Another thing, you cannot change the collation when you're creating a Azure SQL database. So this is fixed. You will always use SQL Latin General CP1 CIAS, which is English, if I'm not mistaken. Another way to say that. So I'll go ahead and create one. So once it is created, what we'll do quickly is we'll go into look into the firewall. And again, this is a server level firewall. I think for data level firewall, you cannot access it through the portal. You'll have to use SQL query language to set your database firewall, and there are stored procedure which potentially you can use it to set those database level firewall. But today we'll cover more onto the server level firewall. But if you really want to, after this session, we will publish those articles, Microsoft articles, which will have instructions as how to set the database level firewall, using the...
Yeah, Neeraj, I have the commands with me, so I'll just show it to them. While showing the demo in SSMS, I'll show that.
Perfect. Awesome. Yeah. So let me just let this get completed, and after that we'll quickly just show you, how do we set it at the server level. So it's taking time. Hopefully it will be done. Meanwhile, let me see if I have. Where's my? This is. All right. I don't have any. It's still being done. All right. Well, what I can do is, okay, I have a SQL server anyway. That I will not wait for it to get created. So, I mean, I have this SQL server. So what I can do is, you come into your SQL server property, click on the Show Firewall Settings, and we have already enabled the service endpoint. Now we'll come over here, and under the firewall setting, we will say that accept traffic only from VNet, the Azure VNet one that we have created. So it's a two-pronged approach. One, enable the service endpoint at the VNet level, and then once that is done, come back to your server level firewall. Okay, so maybe I can go to this one. This was done. Let's look at where is my server name. Yep. And the firewall setting. Yep. So see, this setting by default is turned on, right? I didn't turn it on. This is turned on. That's second thing is by default deny is there. There is no rule. If I try to connect to this Azure SQL, it will fall through because it will not work there because my IP is not added. Right now it's showing my IP. If I have to really do that, I have to add that IP. And again, remember this is a public IP. Now I was talking about the service endpoint. So what I can do is from here, you can look at it that I have option of adding an existing virtual network. This is after I have enabled service endpoint on the VNet. So I will click on add existing VNet, and this is the name that you specify. So let's specify the subscription. So I had in this one, and remember we did this on the Azure VNet 1. So this is where you can, and they can specify the subnet. So I will say that guy accept only from app subnet. So essentially this will accept traffic only from my app subnet using the private IP range of inside the Azure. Now there was a question about how can we do it for an on-prem private IP. Well, I'm afraid today this service endpoint is only it only supports the IP ranges, private IP ranges in a VNet, not on-prem. So for on-prem, if you have to really do it, so what you can do is you can have your traffic go through the netted IP. And that netted IP can be explicitly allowed in the SQL Server firewall. All right, with that, I think this completes the demo of service endpoint. So you can take over the control to show the database level firewall.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Neeraj.
Welcome.
Are you able to see my screen?
Not yet. It's still showing my screen. Okay. Yep. Now I can see it. And meanwhile, I'll try to respond to the question in the chat. All right. Cool. Okay. Yeah, we can see it.
So for server level firewalls, we have it available at the portal, so we can configure the server firewalls there. And for each database, if I have to create a database firewall rule, I'll use this command to set up the database firewall rule. And these are the catalogs, system catalogs, which are available to look at the server firewall rules. So this is the one which is showing me the server level firewall rules that I have created. And this one is for the database firewalls.
So you'll have to use this stored procedure, right? Which is sp underscore set database underscore firewall rules. Okay.
Yes. So yeah, let me try to increase the font size so that see it. Okay, so this is the stored procedure that you will use to create the database firewall rule in any Azure SQL database. And these are the two DMVs. The first one is for server level firewall rule, and the second one is for database firewall rule. So now we'll move back to Neeraj. Can you share the presentation?
Yeah, let me do this.
Okay.
All right, so I think we are done with the demo. So now we'll move into the next section.
Yes.
Where we'll talk about authentication. So, yep, all yours.
Okay. I am still trying to look at the presentation. Okay. Yeah. So in a normal on-premises SQL Server instance, we have two types of authentication. We have SQL authentication, we have Windows authentication, as well as we have domain authentication, domain user authentication. But in Azure SQL database, We have two types of authentication available. The first one will be the SQL authentication. It's the same like we have in a normal on-premises SQL Server instance. So basically, we have a local username and password which is stored inside the database, and these accounts can be created in the master database, or they can be created in the database itself. So in a normal on-premises SQL Server instance, what we do is we basically create a login first using the SQL authentication. So we create a login that is at the server level, and then we have a user mapped to that particular login in the database which we want to access. So let's say if I have a login John at the SQL Server instance level, I can have John user in any of the databases or in all the databases which will be mapped to the login John. But in Azure SQL database, I can definitely have a login which is mapped to a user, but I can have contained user also. So what is a contained user? I can have a user in the database itself without being mapped to the login at the logical SQL Server instance level. That's called a contained user. So this is what we have in Azure SQL DB. So as I said, I can have a login mapped to a user, or I can have a contained user through SQL authentication. Then we have Azure Active Directory authentication. So it's like the domain that we have in normal on-premises databases. We have Active Directory and we have Active Directory users. So we create a domain and we have domain users. The same way we have Azure Active Directory, where we can have users, and I can add those users in my logical SQL Server instance or at the database level. So I can have a Azure AD contained user, or I can have it added in the master database.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly, add some point to it. So, this is a new feature which is unique to Azure. So if you have worked with other cloud providers without taking any name, they have their own IAM sources, but their IAM is not integrated with a database per se. You'll have to use local authentication like SQL authentication. But in case of Microsoft, now you can use your Azure AD identities which live in Azure AD. Now that could be either a local identity, a cloud only identity, or it could be an identity which is synced from your on-prem. So from on-prem it is synced into Azure AD, and you can use that identity also. In fact, you can also use an identity which is federated. So your user is added into your SQL database as a user, and for authentication they'll come back to ADFS, and from ADFS they'll authenticate to domain controller, and then they will be granted access. So this is unique to Azure only, that you can use Azure AD integrated authentication for SQL Server. Now this you can equate to an extent to Windows integrated authentication in on-prem world. But not exactly the same. Now, what is the significance of Azure AD integrated authentication? The significance is, remember, any cybersecurity expert that you talk to, they say that data and the data and the key to the data should live separately. In this case, if you have SQL Server authentication, the data and the key, that is username and password to access the data, also lives on the same server, either at the server level or at the contained database level, right? So the database and the data username, password, or key to access that data also live together. That's a big no-no for security security experts. So what they do is they say that you maintain that separation. And how would you maintain that separation? Azure AD lets you do that, where your identity lives in Azure AD, your identity lives here, and your data lives here, and you can use this identity to access this data. So this is one of way to secure your access to data. The same thing in case of Windows integrated authentication in on-prem. Data lives on the SQL Server, and the identity and username password lives on the domain controller. So both are the separate places. All right, let's move on to the next slide. Gaurav, you can go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Neeraj. So this is a very, very important slide, which is going to talk about Azure AD SQL admin account. So whenever I go ahead and create a logical SQL Server instance, it basically asks me for a server admin account. Now, this server admin account can be either a, a name which will be created as a SQL user in the master database as server admin, or I can give an Azure AD user, and that user again will be created as a server admin inside the SQL Server, logical SQL Server instance. So when I talk about the server admin, there can be either a server admin as a SQL authenticated user or a Azure AD user. There can be nobody else to whom I can grant the server admin permission. It is not possible in SQL Azure DB. So unlike this on-premises SQL instance where if I am sysadmin, I can grant the sysadmin role to any login, in Azure SQL DB I cannot do that. So I can have a server admin as the account which has created that particular logical SQL Server instance, or it will be an Azure AD user. But yes, what I can do is I can create a security group at the Azure AD level, and I can make it as server admin. And in that Azure AD group, I can have different AD users. So that is how I can have multiple server admins.
Yeah, that's a good point. So like, when you refer to server admin, you can have only one server admin. If you do SQL Server authentication. However, if you use Azure AD, there is also you can add only one user or one entity, not a user, one entity. But if you are clever enough, if you add a group, you can add multiple users in that group, and those users will become admin. So that way you can grant multiple, or you can have multiple admin if you use Azure AD group. But you can't do that if you are using SQL Server login. But at the end of the day, only one entity can be an admin, SQL Server admin.
Correct.
All right.
Okay. Okay. So if I have to access a Azure SQL database, either I'll be a server admin, or I can be a Azure SQL database owner, or I can be a Azure SQL database user. These are the only ways to access an Azure SQL database. Neeraj,
yeah.
Regarding this, can we move to the next slide?
Yes. I'm there. Can you see it?
Yeah, it is slightly slow. It is just coming up. Okay, now it's visible. Okay. So if you look at this diagram, I have the Azure Active Directory and I have Azure Active Directory admin, which is a single account. It can be a user or a group. And it is optional if I am not using, this is just an optional way. If I'm not using the SQL Server authenticated logins, I'll be using this one. And it is required if I'm using the Azure Active Directory authentication. So at the server level, if you'll see in the master database, I can use the Active Directory authentication and I can use the SQL Server authentication. Similarly, for the SQL Server admin account, again, it's in the master database, I can use the SQL Server authentication. One thing I just wanted to discuss certain points about this unrestricted administrator, which is server admin. As I said, it can connect to any Azure SQL database on the server, and it is mapped to the DBO user in each user database on the server. And it can definitely create, alter, and drop databases, logins, users in master. It can create the server level firewall rules. So what I mean to say is, the server admin is like a sysadmin that we have on the on-premises SQL Server instance. Now, if you look at the Azure AD integrated SQL user login,
Okay,
Neeraj,
yep.
Yeah. Okay, can we move to the next slide?
Yes.
Yeah, this one. Okay. So I have Azure Active Directory admin. Again, I think it's the same slide. Okay, so this
No,
is this. No, I think now it's okay.
Yep.
So I have the Azure AD integrated SQL user login. So users will be connecting with a password using the database level firewall, and I'll have a SQL Server contained database user using the SQL Server authentication. Or if I'm coming from the Azure Active Directory, I'll have the Azure Active Directory contained database users using the Windows authentication. And as we told you earlier, that the database firewall rule, it can only be configured by executing the statement using the SQL Server Management Studio, sp_set database _firewall rule. And we already saw the the system catalogs that we use to see the database firewalls and the server firewalls. So this is very interesting. The authorization roles and permissions. In an on-premises SQL Server instance, we have several fixed server roles like security admin, sysadmin, backup operator, or I can have sysadmin roles. So there are around 8 or 9 different fixed server roles. Whereas in Azure SQL database, at the logical server instance level, inside the master database, I have 2 roles available. The first one is the DB manager role, which is similar to the DB creator role, which is available in on-premises SQL Server instance. So basically, this role allows a user to create, alter, and drop databases. And the second one that we have in Azure SQL database, it's called login manager role, which is actually similar to security admin role in on-premises SQL Server instance. It allows the users to create, alter, or drop logins. At the database level, there are similar roles that we have on an on-premises SQL Server instance. And as far as the permissions are concerned, we have the same permissions which are available in on-premises SQL Server database, which are like I can grant, deny, or revoke permissions at object levels in Azure SQL user database. Neeraj, can we move to the next slide?
Yeah. So I think, can you see it?
Yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah, so I think this slide, I've just borrowed this picture from Microsoft website. So, here what it's showing the roles and the corresponding permissions. So like, you have the admin roles, and this role has different alter permissions, and it basically goes into detail. So like, every role has a defined permissions which goes along with that role. So like, these details, if you really want to, you can go and refer MSDN, but essentially what we are trying to communicate is there is a mapping between the role, database role, and the actual permission. So what you see over here on the left, on the left side, this is your role, right? And on this side, what you see is all your permissions. So like, any role will have one-to-many association of the existing permission. Now these roles are defined in database, and and you can look at the corresponding permission of one particular role. So those kind of things, you can refer those on the MSDN website also, or you can also, if you want to really interested in knowing more, so you can refer this. Anything you want to add, Gaurav?
Yeah, so I just wanted to show how to create the logins and users, as well as how to grant them
Sure.
roles.
Yep. Go ahead, take over.
Yeah, what do we have in the next slide?
It's a demo, so we can go with the roles and permission. Yeah.
Okay. So let me share my screen.
And Anjan, we will share these slides along with, so after this session, in a couple of days, we will publish this onto our blog website. So, you can just keep refer to our website, AzureEasy.com. That's where we will publish it in the blog, recorded session, along with all the links and the slides, everything. So you will have access to it. All right, I can see your screen.
Okay. Okay, so what I wanted to show you is how do I create a login in a Azure SQL database. So first, what we'll do is
Before
we'll create
that,
a login.
can we briefly touch upon the Azure AD admin for SQL Server? So if you can go back to the portal, if you head back
Oh
to.
yeah. Let me show you that.
Yeah. So, anytime you create a logical SQL server, you will have to set your Azure AD admin. That's a top level server admin that, locally that you create, but in this case is Azure AD.
This is the
And
one.
yep. So yeah, if you click on the Active Directory admin, you'll have to set one of the user as an admin. So, and you can set only one admin, by the way. So this is where you will set it as a user or a group. If you set it a group, the entire members of that group will become admin. If you add a user, then only that user will be granted admin permission.
Similarly, if you want to see the server admin on the server, so this is what I have created with my name. So when I created server admin with my name, and while I was creating the Azure SQL DB with the logical server BNS India, it automatically created a SQL authenticated login with this name and an admin with this name. So let me show you that.
So
So if I
there's a
go,
question. There's a question from Harsha. So Harsha, what you can do is instead of using generic ID, it also supports the app ID. So basically, you can register an app ID in Azure, and using that, you can authenticate via token method also. So you can request a token of that app ID and present that token while trying to programmatically authenticate to your SQL server. I would do that rather than using a generic ID. All right, go ahead. Sorry.
okay, so this is my logical SQL Server instance name, bnsindia.database.windows.net. I'm connected with the server admin Gaurav. So at the instance level, you can see this login which was created because this is the username that I mentioned while creating the logical server instance. And this is created as server admin in this particular instance. So I have security under that I have logins and I have the login name. Now I have this master database and this Azure SQL database that I created. So this is my server admin and this is the Azure AD admin which is created as a user inside the master database. Now if I have to create a login, what I will do is I'll connect to the logical SQL Server instance and inside the master database I'll create this login. So my login is created. I can see it here. So this is my login. And by the way, I cannot create the login using the GUI in Azure SQL database. The GUI is not available. So I have to use the commands, or I'll use the PowerShell or any other language to create the logins and users using the TSQL commands. If I have to create this user,
so this is yeah. So this login that you've created, is this a contained user login or it's a master?
No. Yeah, so it's a login which will be mapped to a user. It's not a contained login.
Okay,
so in my first, in my next second or third login, I'll show you in my demo. I'll show you how to create a contained user.
Okay.
Okay. So this is a normal login with user mapped. So I'll go ahead and create a user now.
Yeah, please. And there's a question from Saurav. Can I use both server and database level firewall? Yes, you can. And
yes, you can do that.
Yeah, and if that's the case, first database level firewall will be evaluated, and then server level firewall.
Yes. Okay, so I have created a login and I have created a user which is mapped with the login John. I I can see this login John, and I can see the user.
So this is where, right, and we can also create a user from Azure Active Directory. If we modify this command and say external, so if we say external,
I'll be showing the demo.
Okay, good. Yeah, so like in the same command, you can add, right now we created a local SQL user, right? So this is a SQL user, but we can also create Azure AD integrated user also as a part of this. So which
yeah, this will be the command for that. Yeah, I'll show you.
Yeah. So the key here is you use the same command, but there is the second line which says from external provider. The moment you add that command, system will understand that this is not going to be sourced from locally, or it doesn't have to be created locally. Rather than I'll create a shadow account, but it will link to an external provider, which is Azure AD.
Yeah. So since I created this login and user John in the master database, I have these two roles available. So I have added John as a member to the DB manager and login manager role. So currently John has the permissions to either create, alter, or drop databases, or add, drop, or alter logins. So this was similar, like, creation of login mapped to a user was like I have an on-premises SQL, but if you look at the roles, these are the roles which are available in Azure SQL DB. Now let me create a contained user. So if I have to
So the difference, yeah, just for layman, like me, Gaurav, what the difference between the normal user and contained user is, normal user gets created as a master database and it has access, or it can be granted access to all the databases, right? And
yes.
Contained user is only belong to one database, and it cannot be granted access across other databases.
Yes, so it will be visible to only one database.
Okay. And this is a feature of SQL 2016. That's when it got launched, and Azure SQL anyway it supports.
Yeah, so it is there in 2016. It came as contained databases and then contained users, okay. And now it is available in Azure SQL database.
Got it. So one of the advantage of using contained user is it becomes portable. You can port the database. You don't have to port the master database. Just port the database. Along with that, your user also gets ported.
And all the permissions earlier, what used to happen was if I had a user which was mapped to login, if I have to take this database and migrate it somewhere else, I had to take care of this fact that I will extract the login from the master database and I'll apply it in the master database on another server. But today I don't need to do that because the user is independent of the login.
Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so I have this Azure SQL DB, which is called BNS. I am going to create a contained user. The username is Kathy, the password, and the default schema. So once I do this, after that, I can add the roles. So these roles are similar to on-premises SQL Server databases. So I'm going to add Kathy for DB data reader as well as data writer. And this is done. How will I see which user or login is granted with what roles? I will show you a query which will show me the system catalogs. It will query the system catalogs and it will show you that. But before that, let's create a contained Azure Active Directory user. So what I'll do is in BNS database, I will go ahead and create a user.
So basically the command is create user, then your username in format of your username @ your Azure AD tenant. And then you say from external provider, so that it gives a cue to the system that it has to be sourced from Azure AD. And then you're specifying the role so you're giving DBO role, which is database owner, right?
Yes, and there's a difference here. If I have to create an Azure Active Directory user, I should be connected with the Azure Active Directory user. If you look at the message that is shown to me now, when I'm trying to create an Azure Active Directory user, it says, principal, this could not be created. Only connections established with Active Directory accounts can create other Active Directory users. So what I'll have to do is I'll have to first connect with the Active Directory users, and then only I can create the users and grant them roles. So
Okay,
what I'll
so
do is,
right now you're connected with local SQL authentication,
yes,
correct? Okay.
yes. So what I'll do is I have this connection here, which is at the master database level. I'm connected with the Active Directory users. Now I'll go ahead and create a new connection. Now inside the BNS database, I'll create a contained user. And now it is done. So if I want to add the roles, I can.
Okay, so you have two connections. The topmost connection is using Azure AD authentication,
Yes.
and the second one was using local authentication, SQL authentication.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
Okay. So now let's have a look at the system catalogs that are available to view the logins, users, and the permissions. So if you look at so instead of sys logins that we have in on-premises, I have sys.sql_logins, and I have for users I have sys.sysUsers. Now if I have to look at the logins, I should be connected with the master database. So I'll just connect with the master database immediately.
Okay, so the table that we are looking at is sys.sysUsers, right? That's it.
Yes, I'll show you that. So the first one is sys.sql_logins. It shows me the two logins in the master database.
Okay, yeah, I see. And also a description says SQL login, so that means it's a local.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
And then I have sysUsers. So if I look at this particular catalog result, I see a lot of users, whereas all of these are not users. Basically, they are roles also. So similar to on-premises, it basically shows me the database roles along with the users. So if I have to look at only the users, I will filter it with this particular where condition. So by this, I'll have only the sys users listed here. So I created John, I created Gaurav at AzureEZ.com. So these are my users along with Gaurav. And if I need to look only at the roles, in that case, I will simply on roles. So here I see only the database roles which are available.
Okay.
So I can see DB owner, DB access admin, DB security admin, the similar roles that I have in on-premises Azure SQL DB. Now, if I have to look at the permissions and the roles that I granted, for that, what I'll do is I'll use this query. After this session, I'll share all these queries so that you all can just download these queries, and they will just come as handy for you whenever you are working on Azure SQL DB.
Yeah, so we'll post that into our GitHub repository and we'll share those details.
Right. So here you can see the name and the permission name along with the database role and the additional database role that we have granted, like DB manager and login manager, I granted to John. Here you can see the DB manager is granted to Gaurav, and Gaurav at AzureEZ.com. So this is how we grant the roles. This is how we create the logins and users in Azure SQL DB. I just wanted to highlight one thing here. If I have to look at the roles at the instance level, so I have this logical SQL Server instance, but unfortunately, inside the security, it doesn't show me any fixed server roles. So though my DB manager and login manager, they are in the master database, instead of looking at the security level at the instance level, they are actually present in the master database. So you can see them here.
Yeah, I see that.
Okay. So you have to remember that. Otherwise, when you are new to Azure SQL DB, you just keep on finding these roles at the instance level, but they are not there. They are inside the master database. Okay, so that was about the logins and users. Neeraj, can we move to the presentation so that we can go towards row level security?
Yeah, so what I would do is like, I think we are 15 minutes past our allotted time, so probably, we'll continue this in the next session. So in like,
Okay. Sure.
so that, but meanwhile, what we'll go ahead and do is, I'll go ahead and unmute the audience and we'll take some questions, and after that, probably we will finish off. So let me go ahead and unmute the audience. So I've unmuted the audience.
I think that will be better, Neeraj, because row level security will definitely take some time. It's a very extensive topic and a very interesting topic, so it will definitely take somewhere around 15 to 20 minutes to explain the topic and then show a nice demo on that.
Yeah. So I also thought like that. So I went ahead and unmuted the audience. So if you have any question, you can unmute. You have to unmute yourself at your end, and then you can speak up and ask those questions. We'll take 5 more minutes, and after that we'll conclude this session. So if you have any question, please go ahead. Any questions? So you'll have to unmute yourself. Though I have unmuted from my side, but you will have to still unmute from your side.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I can hear you. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, yes, Gaurav here.
Yes, Saurav.
Yeah, yes, sir. I have a query. Actually, when I'm allowing client IP in database firewall, then should I allow in network security group also?
Well, network security group is for a VNet, for a VM. This firewall is for PaaS, platform as a service. So NSG does not play a role here.
Port we are allowing for SQL access. 1433 port we are allowing from network security group. So when you are here adding.
Oh, okay. So if your source, yes. So if your source is VM in Azure, yes, then probably you will allow that 1433 port to make sure that is allowed.
Yeah, so if you are talking about SQL Server on Azure VM, then yes, it will be in network security group and you'll have to allow 1433. But in Azure SQL DB, once you set up the server firewall, it automatically takes care of the port. So you don't have to worry about the port number 1433. It will automatically allow the connections.
Oh yeah.
All right. Thank you for your question. Any other questions?
Hi, this is Bharat here. I had a question related to the access control.
Yeah, Bharat, go ahead.
So for my scenarios here, I mean, I don't use any virtual machines at my end. I just use the SQL Server directly, hosted in Azure. And I wanted to know, is that the best way, or do we always have to use a virtual machine so that we can enable only the service endpoints through the service endpoints? Like, how do we secure access to the SQL Server so that one, it's again using firewall rules, I suppose we'll be able to access it from our client machines from work or whatever, and allow only the Azure web services and other things which needs to use the SQL backend. How do we?
So you're talking about a scenario where you have PaaS SQL running in Azure, and then you have components sitting on-prem or your machine in CorpNet trying to access that, right?
Not necessarily. Let's say more about the Azure hosted services, for example, maybe Azure Functions or even Azure Web Services.
Yes. So,
because we don't use any VNet or we don't use any virtual machines. So I'm just wondering how are
yeah, that's a very deep and advanced level topic of security. So right now, Microsoft at this point of time, these services that you've talked about function, when they reach out over the public IP. Right now, in the traffic, the traffic, will come over internet, and you will have to allow, Azure services, the checkbox that has like, allow Azure services at this point of time, until unless Microsoft clearly, so Microsoft publishes the public IP address of their data centers, but I'm not sure if they have provided that split based on the services. So if there is a list of public IP against each of the service, probably you can include those IP ranges in your firewall so that it only accepts the traffic from that service of Microsoft services like function. But again, that will not guarantee that it will only accept traffic from your service Azure function. It can accept from other customers Azure function also. So that's where, once you have database firewall, then you have application and database level access too, where you control through the roles and through the permissions. Even though they can come, they can initiate, but they don't have username and password. They don't have the permissions. So
I see. Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Any other questions? We'll take one more question, and after that, we'll go ahead and conclude the session. All right. We don't have any questions, so I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to everybody, who joined our session, and I really appreciate Gaurav you taking out time and sharing your knowledge with the AzureTalk community. It really helps us a lot, and especially with your knowledge that you have on SQL and database ROM, so that it's really helpful. And I thank you everybody for joining our session. Please keep a watch, and please do register on our website so that you will receive meeting invite and update on our future sessions. And we keep doing these kind of sessions every 2 weeks, and we will post the recording of this session on our YouTube channel, so which is AzureTalk YouTube channel, and we will publish a detailed blog along with all the links and also the article that we have consumed and we have used for preparing this PowerPoint. We'll also publish this PowerPoint slide decks for you guys. So do visit azureeasy.com. It's a community website that we maintain, and we post all our contents out there. And we will also post the scripts, the SQL scripts that we have used in today's session. So, you guys can also go and do hands-on. And we'll continue this. So today we couldn't complete the row-level security and dynamic data masking. We'll continue this in the next session, and we'll take it from there. So thank you, everybody. And we'll talk again, and have a great weekend. And thanks, Gaurav, for taking time to deliver the session.
Thank you, Neeraj, and thanks everybody. It was my pleasure to bring out a session on this nice platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.